Well, hello everyone. I'm John Laughland, the Director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to say that we've Peter Lavelle, our co-host, and as our main guest, Craig Murray. Craig Murray is probably somebody who doesn't need much of an introduction. I expect many people watching us may have come across him before. He has a very considerable internet presence and has also had a fascinating career. He was a British diplomat. He rose to the rank of ambassador. And if I'm not mistaken, Craig, it was about 15 or 20 years ago where you turned against the system and left the Foreign Office to become a human rights campaigner and prolific blogger or journalist. You write frequently on craigmurray.org.uk, and your work is something I've admired for many, many years because it combines both moral and intellectual integrity. And I'm particularly, I admire particularly, Craig, your legal analysis. Of course, you have a political point of view of on many issues, but you often bring a legal analysis to these things, and that's something that that I personally greatly appreciate. I wondered if, of course, the conversation can take its own course, but it occurred to me that there are two big issues that we might like to discuss today. One is the issue of free speech. And the increasingly dictatorial measures that are being deployed, not only in Britain, although you've written about British cases, but also in other parts of Europe, measures taken against either journalists or political activists, particularly on the Israel-Gaza question. And the second issue that I thought we might discuss is the rather broader issue, but of course it's linked to the first one, of the evilness, to put it very bluntly, of the Western system as a whole. That's the subject of your most recent and second most recent posts on your website. Shall we start with the first issue, Craig, of free speech? You are in the firing line of this yourself. You've been detained or arrested. I'm not sure what the vocabulary is. I believe you were held for quite a long time at Glasgow Airport. This has happened to a number of other people, including people who've been on this show, Vanessa Beeley, for example, and to me, albeit in a rather less violent form. And then we've had terrible incidents with two pro-Palestinian activists, Sarah Wilkinson and Richard Barnard, and I believe also Richard Medhurst. These are people that I think you know, Craig. Would you like to tell us what conclusions you draw from these events? And I should add before you answer that we devoted a whole forum 2 weeks ago to the very similar closure of Compact magazine in Germany. So just as with Sarah Wilkinson, where the police turned up early in the morning, so 15 or more policemen turned up at the house of Jürgen Elsässer, the editor of Compact magazine, in a suburb of Berlin. But perhaps you'd like to tell us, Craig, about the cases of these three British activists and, of course, your own experience.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I will. I mean, I'll start off by making a wider point that I hope we'll come back to later in the conversation. But you're right. It's best to start. It's best to then go into the particular and look at particular cases. But I think what's happened, in particular over Palestine and Gaza, and the desire to silence people who don't take the establishment viewpoint on Palestine and Gaza, I think you've got to see that in a climate of a much wider attack on the entire concept of free speech, which has been going on for much longer, and of which all kind of phenomena, like what's called cancel culture, like what the new Hate Speech Act in Scotland, and there are various manifestations of this. And I think what's happening over free speech on Gaza is an extreme manifestation of it. But I do think it's part of a much wider attack. And I think that's important to say because this isn't an issue of left or right. This is an issue where people who might be characterized as being either left or being right are being deprived of freedom of speech. And really, it's a question of an increasing and very general intolerance of people who say things outside what society views as the established point of view or on any particular subject. And the dangers of that are, of course, enormous because it it literally precludes the chance of progress. If nobody's ever allowed to state anything but the orthodoxy, there cannot be progress. It's as simple as simple as that.
An argument made famously, of course, by John Stuart Mill in 1848. It's a very old argument, and it's as true today as it was then.
Yeah, no, precisely. And I think On Liberty is a text which deserves far more study and has fallen out of far too many university curricula in terms of much more fashionable and shallower recent work. But that's something else we can discuss as we go on. But
it's on my university in my lectures, just to let you know. I tell my students about it.
I'm very pleased to hear.
So subversive, John. Okay, there we go.
Well, but in what we're seeing at the moment is a particular, I think, state of panic because the establishment, if you like, the political and media class have really lost control of the narrative on Gaza because it's become very plain and a real exemplar of the fact that what's actually happening on the ground can now be seen on social media in real time on your mobile phone. And yet what you're seeing on television from the established media and what politicians are saying is something completely different. The two just plainly don't match up. And that's how you lose control of the narrative, that the population can observe that the official narrative just isn't what's happening. And that has caused a real reaction from the political class because the political class is wedded to support of Israel. And I personally take perhaps a slightly unfashionable view that's in fact pretty mechanistic and is as much to do with simple corruption and money as it is to do with ideology. I know, I have good friends who argue that I'm being far too simplistic about that, and actually you've got to look much deeper into the roots of Christian Zionism, etc., and the Judeo-Christian tradition. I personally don't see any reason why the roots of Judeo-Christian tradition affect politicians apparently more than they affect the rest of the population. What affects politicians more than the rest of the population is payments from the lobby. But to me, that is the distinction.
Right, but Greg, one of the things that's never explained is that if the people of Israel and the people of the West have such shared values, no sunlight between them, then why do they need a lobby of that magnitude? Why is so much money have to go from hand to hand? I mean, it's completely illogical. This is all based on values, which I think we should talk more about. I don't know what values they are, but that's invoked all the time over any concept of law, which I want to ask you a question about later.
No, I would agree with that, and it also, of course, opens up much wider questions. I've never understood why politicians who are extremely paid for the public purse whilst in office, why they should be able to accept donations from anybody at all. It seems to me an extraordinary thing that you can buy a politician. But that's something else we can discuss as we go on. There are just so many things we've come to accept in society which seem to me fundamentally wrong. But to come on to the particular, in this panic over losing the narrative on Palestine, they've started to just lash on and use the instruments that have been, in many cases, in most countries, I think, there are not only old, but there are newer instruments to restrain freedom of speech, which have been brought in and ramped up over the last 20 years, and in some cases, but much more than that. I mean, in the UK, within the last 5 years, we have a new Public Order Act, which limits freedom of assembly if a demonstration or vigil or whatever the expression of freedom of assembly is, if it's liable to inconvenience anybody. Whereas, of course, if your demonstration doesn't inconvenience anybody, you're not doing it right. This is utterly ludicrous. We've got to, but it just increases police power to control freedom of assembly. So we have a new Public Order Act. We have a new National Security Act, which makes it illegal to receive funding from a foreign hostile power. Hostile may not be the precise word in yet. Frankly, I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. It's hostile or similar, but there's no definition of that, and there's no list of who these hostile powers are that you can turn to. I suppose you're meant to know intuitively that means Russia and China and a couple of places, but they're new offences, newly created offences that didn't exist before under this new National Security Act, which came into power only in January. And certainly a lot of the questioning that's been going on, a lot of my own questioning when I was arrested, appears to relate to that new National Security Act. We have an Online Safety Act, which is in the process of going through Parliament, which was started by the last government, and which the Starmer government is going to keep going. And that is going to make it a crime to publish misinformation. And of course, it is the government that defines what is true information. So these attacks on liberty are being ramped up. And the UK is by no means unique in having increasingly repressive legislation, of which the purpose is the limitation of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And we're seeing this used. I mean, I was arrested under the Terrorism Act of 2005, I think. Or it might be 2003. I don't recall exactly. It's a post.
There are 3 or 4 of them now, so it's difficult to remember which year they were passed.
To know which one, yeah. And I was arrested, and or detained. I wasn't arrested. I was detained, and I'll explain the difference in a moment. That contains an extraordinary provision at Section 7 that you can be detained for 1 hour at an airport or port. Basically, it's at a port, and an airport is defined as a subset of port. And during that 1 hour, you have no rights. All your normal rights are suspended.
That's right. That's the same as I had. But I was apparently under a 2019 Act. But that 1 hour provision is also in the later Act.
Yeah. That and you're detained, not arrested.
The police said you're not being detained, so you don't have access. You don't have a right to a lawyer. Not that I wanted a lawyer, but he said you're not being detained. Well, I wasn't detained.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what they said to me was I was being detained. I wasn't being arrested, because if you're arrested, you have a right to a lawyer, but if you're detained, you are not. But the provisions of the Act say you have no right to a lawyer for 1 hour. You have no right to remain silent. You must answer questions, and you must answer them fully. And to fail to answer a question fully carries a 2-year prison sentence in itself. You must hand over your electronics, and you must hand over all passwords to anything on your electronics.
So maybe sure I understand this. So all your rights are suspended for an hour. All rights.
All rights, exactly.
Yeah. I had the same experience, albeit under a different Act.
When the Act was passed through Parliament, the explanation was given to Parliament that this was being done, and it only applied at ports and airports. And the reason it was being passed was that it was to catch people who had just put a bomb on a plane. And that if someone had just put a bomb on a plane, then that first hour it was necessary that they should have to answer. If a policeman says, "Where is the bomb?" they should have to answer. They should not be allowed to remain silent, so the police could get the bomb off the plane and prevent everybody dying. That was the rationale the government gave for this extraordinary and total suspension of all rights.
By implication, though, that is making the assumption that you and John were terrorist bombers.
Well, you see, that's one of the interesting. The Act also states specifically that the police, it actually states in terms that they do not have to have reasonable grounds of suspicion. They can just stop anybody, and they do not need any grounds for stopping you. So
yes, it's in the Act. It's specifically in the Act. It's absolutely black and white in the actual text that they do not need any grounds for stopping you. And in my case, I made an appeal. I can't remember if I think I told you this, Craig. And it was a rule. I was, of course, ruled against by 2, incidentally, very senior judges. And they said there is no suspicion against Mr. Laughland, but he might be in touch with people who might be involved in this or that. And in other words, the judges themselves confirmed that this was a fishing expedition.
So that means, again, implication, you were involved in a conspiracy.
No, they specifically said I was not involved in anything, but that I might be in contact with people, or I might know people or whatever who might be involved in some kind of election interference. In other words, they were validating what was obviously the case. They were validating the seizure of property for the purposes of fishing, of finding out information.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask a question here. I'm sure both of you are aware of Robert Reich's article that was in the Guardian, which I found to be very explosive, because what we're getting, and Robert Reich is someone of standing, and he's well known and very well admired in his circle, I guess we can put it that way. But he's making the claim, and there seems to be a lot of push behind it, is that speech, and I know speech laws differ across countries, but the idea of speech is now a privilege. It's not a right. Would you agree with that, Craig?
I think, unfortunately, it is coming that way. I mean, I think it's an absolutely appalling suggestion. It truly chills me to my very bones that anybody can actually be making that argument. But it's
But I mean,
certainly in
what
line.
happened to you at the airport? What happened to John at the airport? That Elon Musk and Pavel Durov, they should be just simply arrested. I mean, without any due process of law. I mean, we're getting to the point of a kind of feudalistic privilege. I mean, that's what it's getting down to. I mean, I think it's not only coming to that, we're there.
Well, it is, and when you are stopping journalists and taking all their information off them, taking all their electronics off them, and of course, all of us have very personal stuff on our laptops and phones. We have personal stuff with people to whom we are intimately connected, our friends and family. You just don't want a policeman trawling through your entire private life. This is an outrageous intrusion on privacy and the right to privacy. And when you're using an act designed apparently to catch bombers in order to target journalists and public figures, it's hard to believe. But let me come on to what happened to Sarah Wilkinson, because Sarah Wilkinson is she's an activist and campaigner. She also writes, so she's also a citizen journalist, and she was targeted about a week ago. And Sarah is, the same kind of age that I am. She's not a young lady, and she had 16 policemen come into her house at 7:15 a.m. 7:15 a.m. Some of them in combat fatigues, wearing balaclavas. And they literally smashed up her house. Among other things, they tipped the contents of her mother's funeral urn onto the floor, deliberately, knowing what they were doing. They carted her off to the police station. They questioned her for 23.5 hours under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of support for a terrorism organization. They asked her for all kinds of information. And Sarah's been involved with an NGO which drills drinking wells in Gaza to provide drinking water to the population of Gaza. And among the things she was asked for, which the police insisted she give them, which obviously she had no physical way of giving them on the spur of the moment, they insisted she must give them the geolocation coordinates of all of the drinking wells they had drilled. Now, can you think of any legitimate reasons why they would need? And who tasks her? Who tasked them to get that information from them, and with what purpose? And then she's been bailed. She's been released on police bail, and her police bail charges her to report to a police station at intervals, and she can't. So she's not a very healthy person. She can't drive, and it literally takes 4 different buses. And given rural bus services in the UK, it literally takes her more than 24 hours to get to the police station and to get back. And she has health issues. And her bail conditions include that she is not allowed to hold or use a telephone.
Yeah.
And she is not allowed to use a laptop.
Also, I understand she's not allowed to talk about her detention, or at least parts of it she's not allowed to talk about.
I'm waiting to see. I'm waiting to see what the actual bail conditions say, because it's not entirely clear. The bail conditions apparently, they definitely say she must not use a telephone or laptop. But what after that, some things it's not precisely clear whether that's what it strictly says in the bail conditions or whether that's what she's been advised by her lawyers. So I'm waiting to try and clarify some of that, and I've asked for a copy of her bail conditions. But this is this is just extraordinary. And she's this rather frail lady has 16 police turn up at dawn to barge into her home and smash around her things. It's beyond, and it's a lot further than what they did to John and me, which was very unpleasant, but not nearly of this order. And it's very, very concerning. Richard Medhurst, similarly, a journalist. Now, Richard was actually en route to. He was flying in literally to attend a meeting where he was speaking alongside me on a panel. So I was waiting for him as this happened, and he was arrested at Heathrow Airport. And the plane was stopped short of where it would normally taxi to by police cars on the tarmac. And he was taken off from the plane onto the tarmac. I was just stopped at passport control. He was taken off the plane onto the tarmac in kind of dramatic fashion, with his hands handcuffed behind his back, again like a real terrorist. And then he was questioned. He was held again for 24 hours, for 23 and a half hours. Both of them were denied water. Sarah was denied her medicine during her time in detention. They were both roughly treated. This is some kind of extraordinary intimidation.
But we're talking about it. We know about it. I know a lot of other people know about it, and not maybe in the mainstream. But what is the message that is being sent? And you're talking about an elderly person, also people that are well known in our circles. I mean, obviously, these people are not involved in any form of violence at all. I mean, it's absurd. But they're using SWAT-like tactics. I mean, what is the message? Is it a chilling a message? Don't get involved. Don't stick your head out. I mean, because there were people on that plane. People saw a man taken off in shackles. Okay, I mean, they're sending a message, and is that message is that we don't care about the rule of law, we don't care about freedom of speech because we have power and you don't? Is that the simple message they're sending?
I think it is. I think that's a fair characterization. I think it's designed to chill the journalism of these particular people and to send a message that terrifies everybody else. It can be for little else. And again, Richard Medhurst has bail conditions set, and he lives in Austria. He was flying in. He's a British citizen, but he lives in Austria. He was flying in for a meeting. And his bail conditions involve him reporting to a police station in the UK, for which he has to fly in specially every 3 months. And of course, the idea is that that's going to impact on his activity and his journalism in the intervening 3 months. It's going to chill and scare him. And I think probably neither Richard nor Sarah would object to me saying that they were rattled. This is extremely scary, and just having physical pain.
I saw the interview that Max Blumenthal made with him, and you could tell that he was rattled, and you could tell by his facial expressions is that he was worried that he might say too much to Max Blumenthal, another journalist. I mean, he even kind of took a step back. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I mean, obviously these people are rattled.
I can confirm that. I mean, I had nothing in comparison to the other people we're talking about, but and at the time, my head told me that it was all nonsense and stupid and a complete waste of time. But funnily enough, the physiological effects of the fright lasted for many, many days afterwards. And as I say, I had nothing in comparison to what these other people have had. So it is frightening.
In my case, I was told that I was under it. I wasn't getting my electronics back within the 7 days, which they have. And of course, they have the ability to clone and copy everything on your electronics. They don't actually need to keep your electronics. I received a letter saying that I wasn't going to get my electronics back because I was under investigation for terrorism offences. My lawyer suggested that perhaps living somewhere sunnier than Scotland might be good for my health for a while. So I and as somewhere sunnier than Scotland is pretty well the entire globe. I left effectively for 6 months. I went away until things cooled down. It didn't stop my activity in a sense, but it caused real disruption. I had to change my location and change the way I operate a lot of things, and just having to get new laptops and new phones and get everything up and running again.
Well,
and lose
what I understand also is that in the slight possibility that your electronics are returned to you, it is widely believed that they're bugged. I mean, that not only do they take your information, they want to make sure they can keep collecting it. And as I observed that's also an enormous cost for a citizen journalist. I mean, your MacBook, your earpods, maybe a camera. I mean, those are very expensive items for someone that is doing it on their own, and that is a huge deterrent. I mean, you're put out of business.
I want to come back to something you said a moment ago, Peter, when you said what message is being sent. Perhaps I could use that as a hook to talk about another issue that Craig has written about, which is the arrest of Pavel Durov in Paris, where I'm speaking. It seems to me that the arrest, Craig's article was on a related issue, but it seems to me that the message of Pavel Durov's arrest is very important to ponder. Durov, as Craig pointed out, is not being arrested under the Digital Services Act of the European Union, as some people claim, but instead under French criminal law on racketeering, laws on conspiracy to commit crimes, and so on. And it's obviously a very abusive use of the criminal law, and indeed very worrying that the criminal law should be used against him. But the message is extremely important, because what is that message? If two criminals decide to plot a crime by using the telephone, by ringing each other up, we wouldn't normally say that the phone company is criminally guilty for having permitted them to use the phone to plot a crime. The only way that you could allege that the phone company was somehow complicit is if you assume that it is the duty of the phone company to monitor all conversations on the basis that some of them might be committed by criminals. In other words, the message of the Pavel Durov arrest is that there should be no privacy for anybody. People have been frightened by the claim that there was child porn and drug trafficking or whatever going on Telegram. But I'm not sure that people have thought through the implications of the arrest. You can't say, oh yes, privacy for most people, but not privacy for criminals, because that doesn't exist in this scenario with electronic communication, which, according to the arrest of Durov, the providers of that communication are now supposed to monitor.
Well, I mean, John, that's also, then you can just, let's go beyond the telephone company. Let's say terrorists use a make of a Ford car. I mean, is Ford responsible for what terrorists do in their car? I mean, it's the same argument. Okay.
But the fact is that these telecom companies, whether they are things like Telegram or a simple telephone, there is the technological ability to survey everybody's conversations, or at least governments believe that.
Let me throw it to Craig here. This, obviously, we all know this level of moderation is at least technically, maybe it's technically possible with the NSA, where they can follow everything. I mean, huge amounts of data every hour of the day. But basically, what they're saying is such a national security threat that all of these platforms must be shut down. Either they're absolutely transparent, which is absurd to think about that in these days, or we don't have them at all. They're making an either-or argument. They may not say it directly, but that's exactly what they want to do. They want us to rely upon legacy media like in the good old days.
I think they certainly want to exert very strong control over what I call the gatekeeper corporations that control the internet. I find, for example, with my own blog, 90%. I'm afraid I'm too old and crusty, I guess, to have really taken up any social media since Twitter. But Facebook and Twitter account for 90% of the traffic to my blog between Facebook and Twitter. Facebook and Twitter have both been quite good, despite what Elon Musk says, have actually been quite good at restricting content which the establishment wouldn't want us to see. And by extreme suppression on Facebook and Twitter, the readership of my blog has fallen dramatically. And let me give you one example. When the Julian Assange extradition hearings started, and the first 5 days were at Woolwich Crown Court before it moved to the Old Bailey, those first 5 days I did daily reports from the courtroom. And I was receiving, on my own blog site, I was receiving 2 million people a day, and internationally in the tens of millions, if not possibly the hundreds of millions. But on my own blog site, I was receiving 2 million people a day. And 90% of that was coming through Twitter and Facebook. A few months later, 4 or 5 months later, no more, that the hearings resumed at the Old Bailey, and I was doing the same daily reports in the same way and tweeting them out and putting them on Facebook in the same way. And my readership dropped from 2 million to 20,000 immediately, because basically Twitter and Facebook were simply not showing it to anybody. It was suppressed to death. It just entirely suppressed by Twitter and Facebook, and they have that ability. These corporate gatekeepers have the ability to switch off the audience, and they do that to people. Telegram obviously was less compliant in doing that when people wanted, or when the governments wanted, and we know that TikTok has been less compliant, and that's why they're looking to shut down TikTok. My feeling is that even with Musk being slightly eccentric, they've got sufficient control. The article I wrote was about the Digital Services Act, and it's quite interesting because what the French are doing is directly opposed to the provisions of the Digital Service Act, which actually isn't near. People think it's a bit of Big Brother legislation. It's actually not. I bluntly was surprised myself when I sat down and bothered to read it, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. It's awful, but its provisions actually, it specifically states that Telegram and other providers do not have a duty to monitor content, with a very strong implication they shouldn't be monitoring content. It doesn't in the least say, and do not have a duty to moderate. It doesn't in the least, the only duty they have is when a law enforcement authority comes to them with a specific complaint against a specific individual or specific communication, then they have to cooperate, but not as a kind of general surveillance and not as phishing. And what the French are doing is entirely contrary to European Union law, which is going to be an interesting conflict once the legal case gets going. But again, with a lot of these things, I get the impression that the authorities aren't worried as to what happens eventually with the legal case 5 years down the road. It's the chilling effect of what they're doing to people now, which achieves their impact. So
I think we can all
perhaps they
agree.
might ultimately lose.
I think we can agree, I'm sure the three of us certainly agree, and no doubt many of our viewers, that these are acts of gross injustice, that there is a sustained attack on free speech, that there are all kinds of ways in which abuses are being committed. But Craig, you said a moment ago, or near the beginning of our conversation, that Israel had lost control of the narrative, and that this explains the extremism with which the authorities are reacting. I very much agree with that. And indeed, when the Gaza war started last year, I was struck by the immediate spreading of anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, anti-genocide information and activism on the internet, on the social media. And I was struck in particular, of course, by the contrast between that and the Ukraine war, because we didn't have anything like the amount of atrocity propaganda coming out of Ukraine. And yet one would have expected it to be the other way around, because obviously the Israel lobby is extremely powerful, as everybody knows. The Russia lobby, in spite of what everyone says, is non-existent. And therefore I concluded that these acts of atrocity must therefore really be taking place. It wasn't just propaganda; it really was horrific. And therefore, I conclude that actually, despite these abuses, despite these terrible arrests and so on, which of course we condemn, I do get the impression that the attempts to control the narrative are not succeeding, and indeed, I think they've been failing now. For some time, possibly even since 2011, 2012, and the beginning of the uprising in Syria. The uprising in Syria was meant to be a slam dunk, as the Americans say, and Britain and America and France were supposed to attack Syria, and instead, as we know, it all fell apart, I think, in 2013. And I think that was partly due to dissident media getting the message out of Syria. And I think the same is true. I get the impression the same is true of Gaza as well. Do you share that view, Craig?
I think that's probably true. I think the flood of information is so overwhelming that even by if you reduce the algorithm on Twitter. I've been doing some mathematical modeling, which is quite interesting. The algorithm on Twitter actually seems to me simpler than is generally realized, in that it effectively, things they want to repress, it goes in number of views per repost, and they want to repress, and it appears to go in units of 37.5. If they really want to repost if they want to suppress something very badly, for every repost you get, no matter how many followers the reposter has, you'll get 37.5 views per repost. And if they want to boost something, it will get 150 or even 300. But it goes up in 37.5, 75, 102.5. It goes up in units of 37.5, which is quite interesting. Have a look yourself one day. It's quite an interesting thing to see. But even if you're only doing 37.5 views per repost, if 10,000 people are reposting it, that still ends up as being an awful lot of views. And they no matter how much they've dialed down the algorithms on pro-Palestinian posts, the reach has still been very extensive because it's so awful. Incidentally, you didn't state the concomitant of your Gaza-Ukraine comparison, with which I entirely agree, that you can tell the Gazan atrocities are real just because of the sheer volume of what you see compared to what you see from Ukraine, which they would have much more interest in promoting. Yes, and I think you can also draw the opposite conclusion. That if there were that many atrocities going on being conducted by the Russians, then we would see an awful lot more of it on social media, and maybe some of it doesn't actually exist. And funnily enough, I was thinking this with regard to the horrible strike, and I'm not in favour of war full stop. I think war should be absolutely a last resort. I'm not a complete pacifist, but I'm not pro-war in any sense. And I was horrified by the Russian attack on the Poltava military academy and the people who were killed. But it's a legitimate military target in a war. It's not illegal. It's undoubtedly a legitimate military target. And the Western media has all stated that the attack was on the Poltava military academy and a nearby hospital. Every report says and a nearby hospital, but there's no visual evidence of this attack on a nearby hospital.
Well, and Craig,
at all.
And there is no coverage in the mainstream that this was a military center that had foreign mercenaries, primarily Swedish troops and officers, and that's not mentioned at all either. I agree with you. I mean, I abhor this whole war. I should have never started in the first place. It could have been avoided easily, even in the first few weeks of it. It could have been stopped. But unfortunately, it's the logic of escalation. The Russian forces know where a lot of these installations are all through Ukraine. They can see every single square meter of Ukraine from the air, and this is a reaction, obviously, to what's been going on in Kursk. But I'd like to kind of switch it a little, because I keep seeing the end of Western pluralistic democracy. So I'd like to talk about that. So are we at the end of a pluralistic democracy? I mean, how much pluralism is going to be there, and how much democracy? And we can talk about what it means to be Western, okay, at another time. But I mean, I think this is a very prescient title for our conversation, because the whole world looks to the West, and we can get into the nitty gritty about Western imperialism and exploitation. Oh, that's all fine, okay? It's all part of the historical record. But living in the global South myself, the ideas that have come out of the Enlightenment in the West are more admired now than ever before. It's really extraordinary to me. And because with the upcoming BRICS summit that's coming here, I'm bumping into people from Brazil, from South Africa, from India. It's wonderful. It's a great sense of excitement. And we talk about these ideas about pluralism and democracy and how they're all very important. And then we watch our news feeds, and well, I guess it's just not so important in the West anymore.
Yes, I think maybe we should maybe entitle it "The End of Western Pluralist Democracy in the West." I like to give this example. When Gladstone was leader of the opposition, having been prime minister twice, I think, and was fighting an election to become prime minister for the third time. He stood for election here in Midlothian, where I am, and he made a famous campaign which was essentially opposing imperialist foreign policy, which is a stance he increasingly took as he got older, and he made a series of thunderous speeches around Midlothian, entirely on foreign policy, didn't address anything else, and was elected and became prime minister for the third time. But one of the speeches he made, and this might be a slight paraphrase because my memory fades as my hair gets grayer, but one of the speeches he made here, and it was at a time of the second British invasion of Afghanistan, the second Afghan war, and he he stated that the humble Afghan has every right to the sanctity of his humble hearth as you and I. If he resists us, would you not do the same? What he said. Supporting Afghan resistance against the invading British army. Now then, it would now be utterly unthinkable that the leader of the opposition in any Western country where Western troops were invading another country would say, if they resist us, would you not do the same? Would say that it would be impossible now for our democracy to permit the leader of the opposition in any major Western country to voice the idea that the people fighting the troops of that Western country may be in the right. They would never be allowed to say it.
Begs the question then, that we don't live in a democracy. The example you're bringing up would suggest that there was a democracy. But if you cannot dissent, then you don't have a democracy, because that's what democracy is all about, is to say no at the end of the day.
No, that's my basic thesis, that there was a form of democracy, and certainly there was genuine respect for the notion of freedom of speech and weighing of ideas, and for the notion that it was perfectly fine to adopt different viewpoints. There wasn't a narrow orthodox establishment. What's called in media, of course, the Overton window, which I think nowadays should be called the Overton letterbox, because it's got an awful lot smaller. But I think the reason I go back to Gladstone to make that point is because I think people find it rather shocking. But I would argue that at the height of empire, even, there was more freedom of speech than there is today. But I do believe that's true, and that there was more pluralist democracy and more choice on offer. You know, the ability to vote for people who actually had radically different views, which is no longer the case. It made really, other than the change of personnel, it made no difference who you voted for in the last election in the UK, which is why such a large proportion of people didn't bother to go out and vote at all.
But do you agree, Craig, that Israel, and therefore by extension the West, is losing control of the narrative? That was my earlier question. I get the impression that the West is losing control of the narrative. Of course, it's applying very great brutality within its own jurisdiction to try to regain that control, but it's essentially not working. And if you do agree with me, does it make any difference? Even if the world opinion turns against Israel, as I'm convinced it is, and therefore against the West, is it going to make any difference? Or is Israel's desire, I'm opening a rather large field of debate here, we may not have time, but is Israel's desire perhaps to fly in the face of that disapproval?
I do agree with you. I do think they have lost control of the narrative. I think in part that's generational, in that, and that partly relates to the fact that it is still the case that people, particularly people of retirement age, are much more likely to get their news from the BBC and the Guardian and less likely to get it from social media. So in part that's generational. I think they've entirely lost the narrative among younger people, people under 30 in particular. I think that's very important. I think Israel has lost a sense of legitimacy, obviously in the global south, where that was already in question, but now it's completely gone. But among the ordinary populations in Western countries, I think that has gone, and I think they have lost control of the narrative. And what people are now doing, of course, is questioning the fact that they don't appear to have any ability to control their governments and to stop them abetting genocide. And again, that opens a far wider question, because once you realize that there's something as important as a genocide occurring, you realize that most people are strongly against it, but you realize that what most people think makes no difference at all to the political and media class who rule us. That then opens up a whole different view of the world.
I think what's happening, I mean, I'm sure you both heard that with Elon Musk tangling with the Brazilian government, an interesting side effect, kick-on effect, the Starlink situation he has there, which goes out into rural areas, very poor people. I mean, it gives people access to the world that they've never had before. It's basically free. I mean, and it was really interesting when his legal tussle there, they shut that out. I mean, the reason why I brought that up is that, I think that obviously having a different point of view and challenging power is very problematic now, and it's getting worse. But still, we have a decision-making process in elites. Okay, again, I find this is going back to feudalism, where everybody else doesn't really matter. You may have some kind of tussle at the very top, and that is the substitute. That's the mirage of we have a democracy, people are discussing it. I mean, turn on Fox News right now or CNN, they're discussing things, okay? This is a facade. This is kabuki theater, but it is a substitute for freedom of speech, and it is a substitute for what people used to call democracy.
Yeah, my point was that the second part of my question was whether we as good liberals or conservatives or whatever we are, people who believe in the exchange of ideas and common decency and so on, whether we are not being rather naive in terms of what Israeli policy actually is. I think it was the Prime Minister Netanyahu who said shortly after the events of the 7th of October that Israel would wreak a level of revenge on Gaza, which it would take many generations to forget. In other words, the policy of Israel in Gaza, according to that statement, is cruelty. It is cruelty. It is revenge. It is brutality, if he's to be taken at his word. And therefore, are we perhaps being ultimately very naive in thinking that if the narrative turns against Israel, that makes the slightest bit of difference? Israel, according to this theory that I'm putting to you, is not interested in behaving by the rules, because precisely instead it wants to wreak revenge, which will not be forgotten for generations.
I should say, in the conversation we've been having so far, and we've taken up nearly all our time, but I've been considering the effects of the conflict on Western societies, if you like, as opposed to considering the effects in the Middle East, which is a completely different question. I mean, Gaza is now destroyed. There's no, over 80%, probably 90% by now of buildings are gone. Gaza is undoubtedly destroyed for generations. I personally believe, and I've believed the whole time, that the expulsion of the population of Gaza was the objective, expelling them largely into the Sinai Desert. That hasn't happened. That hasn't quite, partly because I think of a sort of firm non-cooperation from the Egyptian government, at least on that point. But if you look at what's happening in the West Bank now as well, my own view is that Israel intends on a genuine genocide of the Palestinians in their elimination as a people, as a political force, as an economic force, as people occupying any significant amount of land, or as any kind of obstacle for the expansion of Israeli settlement. So I have the starkest of views of Israel's intentions, and I view what's happening in Gaza now and what's happening in the West Bank now as just a slightly more intense phase of a genocide that's been taking place over 70 years. And I've always referred to it as that. I've written of this for decades. So the ability, and that unless China wants to seriously step up, which there are no signs that it does, and counteract American military influence in the Middle East, I don't see that anything is going to stop it except for a substantial reorientation of the Western powers. And I don't see that happening.
But Craig, what does that say about the West? I mean, I agree with you. I mean, this is just the culmination of an agenda that started at the establishment of Israel. I mean, it's all out in the open. I mean, if we read Hebrew, it would even be more stark, because that's what it's been talked about openly and shamelessly. It's talked about. But what does this say about us and the West? That we're just going to watch? Okay, Kamala Harris, in her coronation, we'll give you a child tax credit. Oh, okay, great. No more talk about Gaza. What does that say about the West? Because the West's credibility and legitimacy is completely annihilated. Will it take generations to recover? It won't recover from this. It won't recover from this.
I quite agree. I think and in particular, and it's not just what does it say about the West, what does it do for the institutions that have been damaged, the authority of the United Nations, the authority of the International Court of Justice. I won't say the authority of the International Criminal Court, because I don't believe that institution ever had any credibility. But the International Court of Justice has done, and is still an institution I respect, but is being shown to be impotent. I spent a lot of time in December and January, in particular, at the United Nations in Geneva, and witnessing the pusillanimity of United Nations officials. And there have been a few decent statements, not that much, but the plain worry about offending the United States from United Nations officials and offending the Western powers, because after all, that's where their funding comes from, was palpable. I actually attended a ceremony in Geneva within the United Nations in commemoration of however many UN aid workers had been killed at that stage. It's a much higher number now, at which none of the officials, UN speakers, managed to give any hint of who had killed them.
Passive voice. So people were killed.
Exactly that. And the loss of Western credibility and the loss of credibility of these very important international institutions, I think, is something that's going to come back to haunt us. And it is a part of the process of the transfer of global economic and military power to the BRICS countries from the West, which is plainly happening over a transition which undoubtedly is in course. But there are some of the decent values which Western civilization did propagate, and some of the institutions which Western civilization helps to found, are being abandoned and lost in that process, because of the fault of the West. Let's be plain, not because of the fault of anybody else, because of the fault of this very greedy class. And also, and this is probably a final thought for me, because we're coming to the end of our time. I don't think you can separate all of these questions from the concentration of economic power in the West. This concentration of political power and this totally unrepresented political and media class goes hand in hand with an ever greater inequality of wealth and economic systems which are designed to concentrate capital and have led to these tremendous concentrations of capital where we're approaching the stage where we're going to start having trillionaires, and where a country like the UK has got 700 billionaires, for goodness sake, in a place where apparently we can't manage to feed all our children decently. So I think those trends are all deeply related.
Well, that's an excellent point. And indeed, you made that in one of your recent articles, and I was very impressed by that point. Craig, you've been extremely generous with your time.
We're going to be very selfish. We'd like to see you again very soon. Sorry, John.
Absolutely. I would be happy to carry on for many more hours, but we will indeed respect our usual time limit and put an end to this week's forum by thanking you very much indeed, Craig Murray, and we would be delighted to hear from you again. And we thank you and all our viewers and listeners for joining us this week. Next week, we have Edouard Husson, Professor Edouard Husson, who will be talking on a related matter, the notion of grey fascism. Grey being the colour of old age, grey being the colour of sadism, and grey also being the colour of indeterminacy. So I'll give you that little appetizer for next week's discussion. And thank you once again, Craig. All the best. Goodbye.
Thank you. Most enjoyable. Thank you.